She'll never make it through Echo Black." That was the first thing they said when Major Liora Vance volunteered. A canyon so tight it got erased from flight manuals. A SEAL team trapped. No drones, no healers. Command was already drafting condolence letters, but Liora didn't wait for permission. She climbed into her A-10 and disappeared below radar into a valley so narrow, so deadly, that even satellites refused to track it. They thought she was reckless. They didn't know she'd been there before, and this time, she wasn't coming back empty. This is Veteranbiker. Comment 1 if you're new, 2 if you've been with us, 3 if you ride with us every week. Like, subscribe, and stay to the end. The air inside the Kessel Point Air Base Command Center was thick with the scent of stale coffee, sweat, and a fear so palpable it felt like a low-frequency hum in the bones. Outside, the unforgiving, jagged peaks of the Karakoram mountain range stood silent and indifferent, casting long, bruised shadows in the fading light. Inside, the silence was anything but indifferent. It was the heavy, suffocating silence that follows a desperate, final message. For the past 48 hours, every screen, every sensor, every satellite feed had been focused on a single impossible point on the digital map, a narrow, winding crevice known as Hades Pass. A 12-man SEAL team, call sign Hydra, had been pinned down there for over a day, their mission to neutralize a high-value target gone sideways in the unforgiving terrain. Their last radio transmission had broken through the static just 10 minutes ago. It was brief, scratchy, and delivered with the resigned finality of a eulogy. The silence was violently broken by the last desperate ghost of a transmission. The radio crackled, filled with a static that sounded like the death rattle of 1,000 small machines. Kessel Command, this is Hydra Team, a voice, raw with exhaustion and etched with finality, fought its way through the noise. "We are taking heavy fire from 3 positions. Our last 2 drones are down. Comms are failing." A ragged breath was audible. "This is our last stand. Repeat. This is our last stand. We are surrounded. Need air cover or we won't make it to nightfall." And then, just static. The senior officer, a colonel whose face was a roadmap of 20 years of command, slowly lowered his head. He ran a hand through his hair, a weary gesture of a man who had run out of options. He looked around the room, meeting the hollow stares of his best people. The air controllers, their hands now useless on the joysticks. The intel analysts, their screens showing nothing but a dead zone. The flight ops commanders, their plans now nothing more than worthless scribbles. They were specialists, masters of their craft, but the enemy had chosen a battlefield where all their expertise was moot. The canyon was a death trap. A natural fortress with walls that served as an ambush point and winds that were a lethal, unpredictable beast. And now, a sophisticated anti-air defense. A hunter of any living thing in the sky had made the area a graveyard for anything with a heartbeat. "Status report on assets," the colonel said, his voice a low growl that barely broke the tension. "Negative, sir," a young flight ops lieutenant responded, his voice trembling slightly, the sweat beading on his brow as he stared at the grim data on his screen. "The terrain is a meat grinder. Rotorcraft would be torn to pieces before they even got within a mile of the landing zone. We simply do not have the manpower for ground-based suppression, and the anti-air, it's not just thick, sir. It's a lethal, sophisticated web of heat seekers. Even a flight of our fastest F-16 seconds wouldn't have the angle to hit the targets without risking a friendly fire catastrophe in that narrow pass." The colonel's face was a mask of grim frustration. He ran a hand through his hair, a desperate gesture. "What about a drone swarm? We can try to saturate their airspace, provide some cover." The intel analyst shook his head, his voice devoid of all hope. Too slow, Colonel. They're already gone. The last drone feeds showed the anti-air was a hunter. It's waiting for anything with a heat signature. They'd be confetti before they even reached the canyon. Too slow, Colonel. Another voice cut in, this one from an intel analyst. Their signal is already gone. Even if we launched a swarm now, it would take a minimum of 35 minutes to get there. They don't have 35 minutes, and they wouldn't survive the flight anyway. The last drone feeds showed heat-seeking missiles on the ridges. They're waiting for anything with a heat signature. A collective sigh of defeat rippled through the room. The grim truth sat in the middle of the table, unspoken but understood by all. No aircraft could get in without being annihilated. The canyon was too tight, the heat too high, the anti-air threat too real. A junior officer, Lieutenant Finn, who had been poring over digital terrain maps, suddenly straightened up. He moved to an old, dusty file cabinet in the corner of the room, one that hadn't been opened in years. He pulled out a large, worn map, its folds creased with age. This wasn't a sleek digital display. This was paper marked with thick red and black lines drawn by hand. He unrolled it carefully on a side table, its faded topography a stark contrast to the glowing screens. The other officers in the room didn't even turn their heads. This was a long shot, a desperate final act of looking for a ghost of a chance. Finn's finger traced a line, a thin, menacing serpent that coiled through the heart of the Karakoram Mountains, right into Hades Pass. He looked at the other officers, his eyes wide with something akin to terror. He found it. The line was labeled in thick black marker, Echo Black. The colonel finally looked over. "What is that, Lieutenant?" "Sir, this is the Echo Black flight path. It's an old tactical route from a decade ago. It was removed from the database after a series of failed flight simulations. They said it was suicidal. Too low, too narrow, too unpredictable. Even with the best pilots, the failure rate was 100%. So it's a theoretical path. An impossible one." "Yes, sir. It's a canyon run. It requires the pilot to fly below the ridgelines using the thermals and air currents to stay on course. There's no radar coverage, no GPS. It's all visual navigation and instinct. It was designed for a specific kind of aircraft, the A-10C, but even the Warthog's ruggedness wasn't enough to make it viable in simulations. The risks were catastrophic. They feared losing a pilot, a plane, and the intel. If it ever fell into the wrong hands, it was erased. Another officer snorted. "You're serious? You're suggesting we send a pilot on a suicide mission based on a decommissioned route no one has ever survived in a simulation?" The silence returned, heavier and more oppressive than before. Finn's shoulders slumped. He knew it was a dead end. But he also knew the alternative was a grim truth. The SEALs would die. Just then, a figure stepped forward from the back of the room. She had been standing there silently, observing the controlled chaos, her face a mask of stone. Major Liora Vance, call sign Valkyrie, was not the stereotypical pilot. She was deceptively small, with a quiet intensity that radiated from her like heat. Her brown hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her brown eyes, sharp and intelligent, were fixed on the faded lines of the Echo Black path. She was one of the A-10 pilots stationed at Kessel Point, and her reputation, though whispered and unofficial, was one of unparalleled grit and unorthodox skill. "I'll fly it," she said, her voice a blade of ice, slicing through the thick, suffocating air of despair. Her words didn't just break the silence, they shattered it. Heads whipped around, disbelief warring with anger on every face. A snort of derision escaped a flight ops commander, the sound a bitter echo of their shared hopelessness. "She's out of her mind," someone muttered under their breath. "You can't be serious, Vance," the colonel challenged, his weary eyes narrowing, a flicker of dangerous, desperate hope sparking to life within their depths. We're talking about a death run, not a training exercise. Liora took a step closer to the command table, her gaze locked on the colonel's. I've flown that valley before, sir. It was a personal challenge, a test I put myself through. I know the thermals, the ridge lines, the entry points. It's dangerous, but it's not a graveyard. Not for me. Her voice, while steady, held a new, sharper edge of defiance. The colonel shook his head, the lines on his face deepening with the weight of his duty. Vance, that's below minimum safe altitude. The wind shear alone will tear your wings off. We lose a plane, we lose one of our best. I can't greenlight a suicide run on a hunch. Then don't greenlight a hunch, sir. Liora shot back, her resolve hardening like steel. Greenlight the only chance those men have. If we wait, we write letters. If I go, we give them a chance to come home. A chilling silence fell over the room once more. A grizzled intel officer, his face pale, spoke the unspoken fear of them all. Major, you're hearing this from us. We're telling you it's impossible. Even the SEALs on the ground, the toughest operators we have, said it couldn't be done. Liora met his gaze, her jaw set. The look in her eyes wasn't arrogance. It was the quiet, terrifying belief of a warrior who had found her purpose. Maybe, she said, her voice a low, fierce whisper, the SEALs just don't know who I am. It wasn't arrogance. It was a quiet, unshakable belief, forged in years of failed simulations where she was the only one to find a way in. Missions where others doubted her, and in battles where her unorthodox methods were the only reason she and others made it home. Every pilot had their limits. Liora's were just set a little lower. Literally. The colonel exhaled slowly, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. He knew the risk, but he also knew Liora Vance. He had seen the flight logs from her training. He had heard the whispers from her fellow pilots. They called her Valkyrie, a mythic figure who flew into the jaws of hell and came back with a grim smile. If we greenlight this, he said, his voice laced with the gravity of the moment, you're on your own. No wingman, no flares, no backup. That path is too narrow. A second bird will be a liability, not an asset. I won't need one, she replied, the faintest hint of a smirk touching her lips. This wasn't just a mission. It was a rediscovery of a forgotten truth. The Echo Black flight path, a route that had been erased from military databases due to its impossible difficulty, was not a ghost. It was a dormant memory, a personal demon Liora had faced and conquered once before. She was not just volunteering for a mission, she was returning to a place only she had ever escaped from, proving that the theory of the suicidal canyon run was wrong. She knew that valley, its every treacherous turn, its every unpredictable wind current, its every unforgiving stone wall. It wasn't just a line on a faded map to her, it was a memory, a story of her own grit and defiance. And now she was going back to write a new ending, an ending not for her, but for the 12 men waiting for an angel in a place where only death was supposed to fly. The twin General Electric turbofans of the A-10 Sea Thunderbolt II, call sign Valkyrie, hummed with a dormant ferocity on the tarmac. Crew chiefs, their faces grim and set, worked with a silent, methodical urgency. They weren't just prepping an aircraft, they were preparing a vessel for a journey into a place no one was supposed to go. They checked the heavy titanium armor plating, a feature that earned the Warthog its legendary status as a flying tank. They double-checked the fuel gauges, the flares, the ammunition for the GAU-8 Avenger cannon. Every bolt, every wire, every hydraulic line was inspected with a level of scrutiny, usually reserved for the final moments before an interstellar launch. There was no room for error, no tolerance for imperfection. Major Liora Vance, her flight suit a second skin, moved with the same quiet intensity. As she climbed the ladder into the cockpit, a junior mechanic, the same one who had unearthed the Echo Black map, handed her a small hand-stitched patch. It was a simple design, the silhouette of a lightning bolt descending into a valley. "We all heard, Major," he said softly, his voice full of a reverence she hadn't asked for. "Don't let them say it can't be done." She gave him a thin smile, a rare flicker of warmth in the cold intensity of her focus, and clipped the patch to her flight suit. "They don't know that I already have," she murmured, and then the canopy closed, sealing her in a world of her own. Inside the cockpit, a profound calm settled over her. The frantic energy of the command room and the anxious silence of the ground crew were gone, replaced by the peaceful hum of her instruments. Her hands, calloused and strong, moved over the controls with a grace that came from years of relentless training and a deep symbiotic connection with the machine she was about to push far beyond its limits. Fuel gauge steady, flaps responsive. The Avenger cannon loaded and armed, a devastating promise nestled in the belly of the beast. "Talon Tower, this is Valkyrie 1. Ready for wheels up," she radioed, her voice calm and even. "Talon Tower copies, Valkyrie. You are clear for takeoff on heading 130. Godspeed, Major." The roar of the engines was a guttural challenge to the silent mountains as Liora's Warthog surged forward, tires screeching a final farewell to the solid ground. The dust trailed behind her like a storm cloud, a magnificent defiant plume in the desert air. She climbed, banking sharply to align with the mountain pass, a green blip on the radar screen of the command center, a fleeting heartbeat of hope. Within minutes, she vanished behind a jagged ridge, leaving only the oppressive silence and the tension that hung in her wake. The blip disappeared. The comms went dark. She was gone. Liora didn't just fly, she became an extension of the metal and fire around her. As she entered the mouth of the Karakoram, the terrain rose on both sides like the jaws of some primeval predator ready to snap shut. She dropped her altitude, nose down, watching the rocky edges blur past her canopy. The wind buffeted her wings, an invisible, malevolent hand trying to throw her off course, but her hands never shook. Every movement was instinctual, a dance she had rehearsed not in simulations but in the quiet, dusty solitude of her mind. She thought of the men in that canyon, her brothers in arms, waiting in a place where every second was an eternity of fire and death. This wasn't just a mission, it was a debt, a return favor for every time they had risked their lives for pilots just like her. She was now flying the Echo Black Path, a serpentine route below radar, under the sun's direct line of sight. The onboard navigation was useless. The GPS had no signal. This was pure, unadulterated visual navigation. She read the canyon like a book, its every fault line, every thermal, every treacherous turn etched into her memory from years ago. Her wings rocked gently, skimming the turbulent air between stone walls that seemed to lean in closer, daring her to miscalculate by even an inch. The A-10 groaned, its titanium armor holding firm as she threaded the needle of the valley's terrain, a ghost of the sky moving through a forbidden land. She was so focused, so in tune with the machine and the environment, that the first sound of a distant mortar barrage barely registered. It was a low, percussive thud that was quickly swallowed by the roar of her engines and the howl of the wind. But then came the second, closer, and the third, even closer still. They weren't targeting her but something else. A sudden, violent tremor shook the canyon. On the ridgeline high above, a section of rock, destabilized by the barrage, broke free. A massive landslide. It was a nightmare made real, a monstrous curtain of dust and falling rock that descended into the valley with a thunderous roar. In an instant, her world was reduced to a swirling, blinding vortex of brown and grey. Dust and pulverized stone filled the air, thick and impenetrable, slamming against her cockpit. She lost all visual reference. The ground, the sky, the canyon walls, everything vanished. For 12 agonizing seconds, she was flying blind, a metal bird trapped in a stone hurricane. In that maelstrom of chaos, the rulebook was not merely useless, it was a ghost from another world. The cockpit was no longer a cockpit, but a thunderous cage where every shudder of the airframe, every scream of the wind, was a new language of mortal danger. Liora's hands, trembling not with fear but with the sheer effort of will, felt the plane's subtle protests through the stick. It was not her brain that flew, but the ghost of the canyon itself, a phantom map etched into her very bones. She navigated by the feel of it, the sudden vacuum of a displaced thermal she couldn't see, the violent shudder of a falling rock she could only intuit. Her body, trained to the peak of human capability, registered every tiny shift in pressure and wind current, making micro-corrections with a practiced, desperate grace. She was not a pilot, she was a medium, channeling the will of the canyon to defy the avalanche. Below, in the suffocating hell of Hades Pass, the world was a brutal symphony of noise and heat. The air, thick with the smell of scorched earth and cordite, choked the lungs of the 12 men fighting for their lives. The constant percussive thunder of 100 rifles was the only soundtrack to their imminent end. Then, a new sound, a deeper, more primal roar, reverberated through the canyon. The SEALs, hunkered down behind a burnt-out vehicle, felt the very earth tremble beneath them. It was a sound that carried the weight of the mountain itself, a wave of pulverized stone and dust. A monstrous brown curtain descended from the ridgeline high above, a direct consequence of the enemy's relentless mortar barrage. The team leader, a man whose face was a roadmap of scars and whose spirit was forged in 100 battles, looked at the sight and felt the last flicker of a dying ember of hope go cold within him. Blood seeped from a gash on his cheek, a physical reminder of their losing fight. He rasped, the words a bitter, personal epitaph to their fate. That's it, whatever they were sending, air support won't make it, it's too tight. That's not a landslide, that's the mountain making good on a promise. It's burying us alive. His men, their faces etched with a grim, exhausted finality, didn't need words. They checked the ammo in their magazines, a quiet, professional act of preparation for a final, glorious stand. They didn't curse their command. They didn't rage against the odds. They simply accepted the rules of the mountains, rules that had now claimed them. They prepared to die, their grim resolve a cold, hard comfort in the face of certain death. They were wrong. Liora's Warthog groaned and shuddered, its sturdy frame withstanding the impossible punishment. The dust cloud, a suffocating shroud of pulverized rock, finally began to thin out. 1 second, 2 seconds, 10 seconds, and then, with a violent shudder, her A-10 broke through the curtain of grey. She saw the sky again, a brilliant, unrelenting blue, and she saw the ground, the jagged, treacherous canyon floor that was now just a few dozen feet below her. She had made it. She had flown through a blind nightmare and come out the other side, her hands still steady on the controls, her heart a drumbeat of pure, unadulterated resolve. She had proven that the canyon could be navigated. She had proven that instinct could trump chaos. And now, as she banked to align with the valley floor, she saw it. The smoke columns, the burnt-out vehicles, the enemy positions dug into the elevated ridge lines. The real fight was about to begin. The SEALs had given up hope, but their angel had just arrived. The roar of the engines, which just seconds ago had been a defiant roar against the silent mountains, now gave way to a focused, deadly hum. Liora Vance emerged from the tail end of the dust cloud, the A-10 a steel phantom, materializing from the chaos. Below her, the valley floor was a tableau of a desperate battle. The glint of muzzle flashes from above, the smoke from spent grenades, the grim, static silhouettes of the SEALs huddled behind what little cover remained. Her targeting system, battered and flickering from the turbulent flight through the landslide, was useless. The sensors were screaming, but she silenced them. A familiar, almost comforting act of defiance against a machine that didn't understand what she was truly capable of. Manual, it is, she whispered to herself, her eyes sharp as a hawk's, scanning the elevated ridges. She saw it all, the makeshift bunkers carved into the rock, the RPG teams setting up for another volley, the enemy fighters scrambling to position themselves with a high ground advantage that, until now, had been invincible. From her vantage point, just 100 feet above the canyon floor, it looked like a slaughter waiting to happen. The enemy thought they had the high ground. They weren't prepared for an angel to descend from below their line of sight. She dove hard. Her entire body was pressed against the seat as G-forces surged, the nose of the Warthog dropping like a spear. Her fingers hovered over the trigger, a delicate dance of anticipation and control. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon, a weapon of legend, spun up with a mechanical growl that was both a promise and a threat. It was a sound that had brought terror to countless battlefields and hope to countless men on the ground. Today it was her voice. She squeezed the trigger. The cannon thundered. It wasn't a series of bursts, but a continuous earth-shaking stream of depleted uranium rounds that tore through the ridgeline. Flames burst. Rocks exploded. The air was filled with the deafening, bone-rattling concussion of 4,000 rounds per minute, unleashing fury on stone, flesh, and metal. The enemy fighters scattered, a frantic, desperate rout of men who had just seen the very ground they stood on vaporized. Some didn't even get the chance to run. "Splash one," she radioed, the words a calm, steady counterpoint to the chaotic symphony of her weapon. Far below, the SEALs, huddled in their positions, looked up in stunned silence. They had felt the ground shake, heard the terrifying roar of the cannon from an angle that made no sense. They saw the ridgeline above them, the source of their torment for hours, erupt in a spectacular fireball. A single grey streak, moving too fast to identify, had screamed past them like a thunderbolt, a promise of salvation delivered on wings of fire. A cheer, ragged and hoarse, went up from the surviving men. They had seen their guardian angel, and it flew impossibly low. Liora banked left, her wingtip just meters from the canyon wall, the debris from her attack flying in her wake. Her mind processed a dozen threats per second. The possibility of remaining RPGs, stray heat signatures, the location of makeshift bunkers she hadn't hit on the first pass, but her hands never trembled. Every move was a calculation, every second was a culmination of a lifetime of training, a lifetime of defying expectations. The enemy, she knew, would be scrambling. They weren't used to air support flying below them. They were looking at the sky, and she was already in their backyard. She was in her element. It was here, in the chaos and controlled violence of the cockpit, that Liora truly felt at home. This was not the sterile, predictable world of official protocol and standard operating procedures that had almost broken her. Her thoughts briefly drifted back to a time far from this brutal landscape years ago, in the sterile heat of a high-profile flight program. It was a program designed to produce the next generation of top-tier fighter pilots, a place that was less a training ground and more a monastery of perfect pilots. It was rigid, demanding, and utterly unforgiving of anything that strayed from the rule book, a scripture of data, sensors, and flawless procedures. Liora, then a fiery young lieutenant, a maverick with a purpose, found herself in constant bruising opposition to her instructors. Her instincts, sharp and unteachable, were a force of nature that clashed with their rigid orthodoxy. She had a near-mystical knack for reading the sky by eye, feeling the subtle push and pull of the thermals, and sensing the air currents in a way that seemed to bypass the need for flashing digital readouts and screaming instruments. "Your reckless instincts are a liability, Lieutenant Vance," her commanding officer had snapped during one particularly brutal debriefing, a public shaming where her flight data was displayed for all to see. The incident was a simulation, a high-altitude dogfight where Liora, ignoring her perfectly functional HUD, had dropped to a dangerously low altitude. She had executed a maneuver that by all known laws of physics should have resulted in a stall and a catastrophic crash. Instead, she had used a complex invisible thermal draft to gain an advantage and splash two of her opponents in a way that was technically impossible. "It worked, sir. I won. It worked by a miracle, Lieutenant." "You risked the entire mission on a hunch. We don't fly on hunches, we fly on data, on procedure, on what we know will work 100% of the time. Your instincts are a dangerous, unreliable variable." She was officially cast out of the program, a casualty of the system's merciless demand for conformity. Her raw, untamed talent, her gut instinct that had won impossible simulations, was deemed not just a liability, but a threat, a rogue element in a carefully constructed machine. Her career, which had once promised a bright, soaring future, was grounded. Her punishment was to be sent to an A-10 squadron, a place where a different kind of pilot was needed, a ground attack pilot, a guardian angel for the troops who knew that sometimes the only way to get the job done was to get your hands dirty and fly closer to the ground than was ever considered safe. It was there, in the dusty, pragmatic world of the A-10 hangars, that she met him. He was a nameless mentor, a ghost of an old war, a retired Air Force pilot who now spent his days working in the maintenance bay. His hands were perpetually stained with grease and oil, but his eyes held the deep, knowing wisdom of a man who had seen it all. He saw something in her that her instructors had missed, a deep, almost spiritual connection to the act of flying, a wildness that he himself had once possessed. He became her teacher, her guide, and her conspirator, passing on the forbidden knowledge that had saved his own life 100 times over. He took her up in a beat-up old trainer, a rattling relic with more patches than paint, and flew her into the canyons and valleys of the Arizona desert. "Forget the sensors," he'd rasped, his voice a gravelly echo in the headset, the sound of a man who had lived a lifetime on the edge. "Forget the GPS. The instruments lie. The sky talks to you, Liora. The mountains whisper. The air tells you where it's going. You just have to listen with more than your ears. You have to feel it in your bones." He taught her how to read the terrain by eye, not by instruments. He showed her how to feel the wingtip vortex of a nearby jet without ever seeing it, how to use the invisible thermals to her advantage, how to fly so low and so fast that the ground became a blur and the world was reduced to instinct and memory. He was a maverick, an old-school pilot who believed that the machine was only as good as the man or woman in the cockpit, and that sometimes the only way to win was to break the rules. "The rule book runs out, kid," he told her one evening, wiping grease from his brow. "But your gut never lies. You just got to learn to trust it. That forbidden knowledge, that trust in her own instincts, had saved her in that high-altitude dogfight simulation. And now it was saving a dozen men in a real-world canyon of fire and death. Her strafe was a perfect, deadly line, a surgical strike that had nothing to do with sensors and everything to do with muscle memory, with an intimate knowledge of how to read the terrain, how to feel the air, and how to trust a gut instinct that told her exactly where to fly. "Echo Team," she called out, her voice firm and clear, a single beacon of calm in the chaotic roar. "Extraction route is opening. I'll clear the path." A heartbeat of silence followed, a moment of profound disbelief. Then, the SEAL team lead's voice, a raw, choked mix of disbelief and relief, crackled over the radio. "Understood, Valkyrie. Moving now." The call sign, spoken by the men she had just saved, landed in her ears not as a nickname, but as a title she had finally, truly earned. Liora smiled grimly. a weary, triumphant expression that only she could see in the echoing cockpit. This wasn't about protocol, about following a rigid rulebook that had failed to account for this valley's reality. This was about doing what had to be done when no one else could or would. She throttled forward, a new target in her mind, her fingers dancing across the controls with a practiced, lethal grace. One more pass, just one more. The training from her nameless mentor, the quiet rebellion against a system that had tried to ground her, was no longer a theory. It was a weapon. She was not just flying, she was executing an act of defiance, and in doing so she was building a wall of fire between the living and the dead. The sky, once a cage of rules and regulations, was now hers, and she was its master, a warrior with a forbidden skill that had just become their only hope. The terrain wasn't just dangerous, it was actively suicidal. Liora, having successfully cleared the first ridge, throttled her A-10 forward, diving deeper into the labyrinthine folds of the Karakoram Mountains. The canyon walls folded tighter, leaning in like jaws preparing to crush her Warthog with one wrong twitch. She was now under 150 feet and dropping lower, threading between walls of red stone that seemed to dare her to make a single mistake. Every instinct, every ounce of rational thought screamed at her to pull up, to gain altitude, to escape the deadly compression of rock. But she kept descending. Her mission wasn't to survive, it was to save. Her cockpit was a symphony of blaring warnings: altitude, heat, lock, terrain proximity. The digital console was a manic Christmas tree in the middle of a war zone. She silenced the alerts manually one by one, the quiet clicking of the switches a counterpoint to the thunderous roar of her engines. Too much noise, she muttered to herself, her eyes locked on the digital map, then on the terrain ahead. Her onboard navigation system was nearly useless now, its GPS signal fried from the heat and low altitude. She was flying in territory the computers barely registered. It was all visual from here, a gut-wrenching dance between instinct and imminent collision. Below, the seals moved with a desperate, feverish trust, a prayer in motion against the pale, dry creek beds and rocky cover. They were a blur of dark uniforms, their frantic retreat fueled by a blind faith that the warrior they had just seen, the one who flew in an impossible way, could somehow keep the hellish reality of the battle at bay. Liora was their shield, a single, fragile barrier of steel and fire between them and death. If she failed, they were dead. She was a living, breathing promise of salvation. And the weight of that promise was a physical thing, a crushing pressure in her gut that she couldn't afford to break. And then the canyon, as if sentient, played a cruel trick of physics. A sudden, violent thermal gust, an unpredictable updraft caused by the late afternoon sun bouncing off the red rock, shot through the valley like a malevolent spirit. It grabbed her left wing, a violent, invisible hand lifting it just enough to throw her trajectory off by a handful of precious degrees. The canyon wall, a solid, unforgiving face of granite, a silent, waiting predator, leapt toward her with a terrifying suddenness, ready to claim its prize. "Pull! Pull!" she shouted to herself, her voice raw in the enclosed space. She yanked the stick hard right, pushing full rudder. The Warthog groaned in protest, metal creaking under the impossible stress. Her left wingtip scraped the rock wall, a sickening, grinding sound that tore through the cockpit's insulated silence. Sparks flew, a brilliant, terrifying shower of light against the red stone. For a second, everything felt weightless, a terrifying free-fall into certain death. Then, with a shudder, she stabilized, the plane fighting its way back into a controlled flight path. But the damage indicators were screaming now. A string of alarms lit up her console, an electronic litany of failure, left-wing sensors damaged, minor hydraulic leak. Stabilizer flap offline. She gritted her teeth, the taste of adrenaline and fear sharp on her tongue. Her plane was wounded, a bleeding bird, but she was still flying. "You still with us?" The SEAL team leader's voice, sharp with concern, crackled over the radio. "Little turbulence," she responded coolly, her voice betraying none of the terror she had just faced. "Still flying." At Kessel Point Air Base, the colonel and his team watched the telemetry feed with bated breath. The blip representing Liora's A-10 had vanished moments ago, replaced by a flood of red text indicating critical damage. The hydraulic leak was a death sentence waiting to happen, a slow bleed of life from the machine. "She has to pull out," one of the intel analysts said, his voice laced with the same cold, detached logic they had used to classify the Echo Black route as suicidal. "The plane is a liability now. We can't risk a full mechanical failure inside the canyon. It's over." The colonel's jaw was tight. He saw the cold numbers, the protocols, the grim reality of the situation, but he also saw something else. The blip was still moving, the plane was still flying, and he had given his word to Major Vance. "We wait," he said, his voice a quiet command that brooked no argument. "The mission is still in play." Liora, a world away from the high-stakes debate unfolding in the sterile command room, was a prisoner of a reality all her own. Just beyond the bend of the next canyon corridor, her keen eye spotted movement on the far western ridge. It wasn't just a few scattered fighters, it was an entire enemy platoon, a wave of heavily armed insurgents who had recovered from her last attack and were now repositioning for a decisive blow. A chilling certainty settled over her as her gaze fell upon one man, a manpad, a shoulder-fired anti-air missile slung menacingly over his shoulder. She had no flares left. The brutal scrape with the canyon wall had bled her last countermeasures, and a single missile lock would be a death sentence. A normal pilot, with a wounded plane and a direct threat in front of them, would have no choice. They would retreat, call for support, turn back, and live to fight another day. They would choose logic. But in that moment, a cold, hard truth, forged in a lifetime of defiance, settled over her. Liora wasn't a normal pilot. Her instincts, the very thing that had gotten her kicked out of flight school, were screaming for her to fight. The A-10, wounded and bleeding, was no longer just a machine. It was an extension of her own will. And its will was unbreakable. The name they had given her, the whispers of the ground crew, the legend she had fought so hard to live up to, it all came down to this. She was a Valkyrie. And a Valkyrie does not retreat. With her hydraulic system bleeding and the plane's maneuverability compromised, a direct attack was too risky. She couldn't bank hard enough, fast enough to escape a missile lock. So she made a decision that flew in the face of all reason and protocol. She decided to lie. She throttled up, pulling her nose up and banking away from the canyon, feigning a retreat. The Warthog, a wounded and lurching beast, moved clumsily, a convincing performance of a pilot in distress. The enemy fighters on the ridge saw it. They saw the plane turn tail and run. A cheer went up among the platoon, a collective shout of triumph. The warrior who had descended from the sky was retreating. The manpad operator smiled, lowering his weapon. There was no need for a missile now. He and his platoon emerged from their concealed bunkers, positioning themselves for a celebratory volley of fire at the retreating jet. They were exposed, they were confident, and they were dead. Because Liora Vance wasn't retreating, the moment she was out of sight behind the ridge, she executed a flawless, death-defying inversion. She rolled the A-10 90 degrees, then banked hard from the opposite ridgeline, flying in from an angle the enemy would never have expected. The hydraulic leak made the maneuver a brutal, punishing struggle, the controls fighting her every inch of the way, but she pushed through it, her arms trembling with the strain. The world outside her cockpit became a chaotic blur of sky and rock, a dizzying, terrifying inversion illusion of reality. She was flying upside down, defying gravity and logic itself. Her targeting computer was still dead. Her aim was all instinct, all the forbidden knowledge of her nameless mentor flooding her mind, telling her where to aim, when to fire. Her fingers moved with a practiced grace, dialing in the manual cannon angle. She lined up the shot, the reticle a phantom of her own creation. The Ju-8 Avenger cannon roared again, its sound deafening, its power apocalyptic. Rounds ripped through the south ridge like a chainsaw through dry timber. The insurgents, now completely exposed and celebrating their victory, vanished in clouds of smoke, dirt and flying debris. Trees split, boulders shattered, and the platoon was utterly, surgically obliterated. Below, the SEALs, still recovering from her first pass, saw the second attack. They saw the A-10 disappear and then, impossibly, reappear from the other side, an inversion of a flyby that should have been physically impossible. They saw the sky turn inside out as the plane on its side and with its cannon roaring delivered a curtain of death across the ridge. "Holy shit!" one of the SEALs whispered, his voice full of a stunned awe he had never felt before. The sky just turned inside out. Liora pulled out of the inversion strafe, her A-10 rattling and groaning under the strain. The damage was stacking up, the alarms in her cockpit a constant, relentless hum, but the threat was neutralized. The SEALs were clear. She had pulled off a maneuver that should have been impossible. An act of defiance that had not only saved her, but had annihilated an entire platoon of enemy fighters in a single magnificent, death-defying pass. She was wounded, bleeding, but she was still flying. And the SEALs on the ground knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that their angel was no ordinary pilot. The inversion strafe was a maneuver born of pure desperation and an almost pathological defiance of physics. As Liora pulled her A-10 out of the dive, the world righting itself in a chaotic, dizzying lurch, the plane groaned under the impossible strain. The damage was stacking up, a catastrophic litany of failures that filled her cockpit with a cacophony of alarms. The left hydraulic system, compromised from her scrape with the canyon wall, was now bleeding out, its vital fluids dripping onto the floor of the valley far below. The A-10 felt heavy, sluggish, a wounded beast that was fighting her every inch of the way. Every movement of the controls, every subtle correction required a monumental effort of will and physical strength. Her hands ached, her forearms burned, but she held on, a grim resolve etched onto her face. The job wasn't over. Not yet. Her radar, barely functional and glitchy from the heat and altitude, picked up the first sign of salvation. Two blips, large and slow, lumbering into the mouth of the valley. The Chinooks, the extraction helicopters, the sight of them, heavy rotors chopping the thin mountain air, brought a wave of relief that was quickly replaced by a new, more urgent terror. They were like lumbering giants, majestic and vulnerable, easy targets for any coordinated ground fire. They moved with a slow, deliberate cadence, their heavy lift capacity making them perfect for extraction, but their speed and size making them sitting ducks in this unforgiving terrain. Liora circled once, a guardian angel with smoking wings, her A-10 a silhouette of defiance against the afternoon sun. The Chinooks began their descent toward the small, pre-designated landing zone, LZ. Their pilots, likely already tracking the same damage indicators from her bird that command was, were trusting that whoever had cleared the canyon had truly cleared it. They were placing their lives, and the lives of the SEALs they were about to extract, in her wounded hands. Just as the Chinooks were about to make their final approach, her radar blipped with a new, more immediate threat. Something was moving fast on the valley floor. Two blips, small but rapidly accelerating, racing down a makeshift dirt road. Liora's eyes, trained to find the needle in the haystack, instantly made visual contact. Two technicals, pickup trucks with mounted machine guns. They weren't shooting at her, they were heading directly toward the Chinook's extraction route, a perfect ambush point where a small force could inflict catastrophic damage on the slow-moving helicopters. The insurgents were nothing if not opportunistic. They had seen the air support arrive, and they were adapting. Negative, she growled, the word a raw, guttural rejection torn from her throat. It was a refusal to concede to reality. Her fuel gauge, a mocking eye of crimson, blinked a steady beat of certain doom. Her left engine, a choked, dying cough that promised total failure at any moment, was a constant, terrifying symphony of protest. She had been flying too low for too long, pushing the aircraft into zones it was never meant to operate in for sustained periods. The engine temperature spiked, the air pressure fluctuated wildly, and every system in the A-10 screamed in protest, a cacophonous chorus of imminent mechanical failure that was slowly driving her to the edge of sanity. A cold, professional part of her brain, a voice from another life, calculated the odds. She had enough fuel to make it back, barely. If she turned tail now, she could limp back to Kessel Point, maybe even make a rough landing. Her life was in her hands, a fragile, trembling thing she could hold on to. But she looked at her hands, calloused and scarred, and knew they had a different purpose. They had a promise to keep. The SEALs were almost there. The Chinooks were exposed. There was no one else. "One more pass," she said, her voice a determined whisper in the echoing cockpit, a broken promise to herself and a sacred oath to the men below. She nosed the Warthog downward, aligning herself behind the speeding technicals, entering a terrain that was more of a grave than a battlefield. The terrain here was a kill box. Cliffs on one side, a dense cluster of jagged rock formations on the other. Any mistake, any slight miscalculation, and she wouldn't just crash. She would become a permanent part of the valley's skeleton, a monument to a promise she had failed to keep. She ignored the fuel warning, silenced the engine temperature alert, and dropped her altitude again, bringing her down to an impossibly low 60 feet. The trees on one side and the rock wall on the other were a blur. A claustrophobic tunnel of green and red, a descent into a hell she had already cheated twice, but now she was willingly walking into it for a third and final time. She had to be precise. The GAU-8 was her only weapon, and with her damaged flight controls, she had one shot, one chance to eliminate the threat without becoming a casualty herself. She lined up the shot in her mind, a mental calculation of speed, trajectory, and wind resistance. Her fingers, despite the pain, moved with a practiced grace, dialing in the manual cannon angle. She wasn't just flying a plane, she was piloting a 30,000-pound projectile with the intent of a marksman. The first truck, a battered Toyota with a heavy machine gun mounted in the back, came into her sight. Its driver, oblivious to the metal ghost that had just descended into the valley behind him, was focused on the helicopters above. "Not today," she whispered. She squeezed the trigger. The Avenger cannon, a force of nature, unleashed its furious burst. Rounds tore through the technical, a continuous, deafening volley of depleted uranium. The truck erupted into a spectacular fireball, its tires screeching as the momentum of the explosion sent it careening into a large boulder. It vaporized in a cloud of smoke and fire, its contents a footnote in a larger war. Liora banked hard, pulling out of the kill box with a shuddering, violent lurch. The second truck swerved, its driver reacting to the explosion of the first, its mounted machine gun operator desperately trying to locate the source of the attack. But Liora was already gone, her A-10 a blur of grey metal as she circled back to re-engage. She had taken down one threat, but the second remained. Her fuel light was a steady, mocking red. Her systems were screaming, but a clean corridor was a promise she had to keep. The Chinooks were still vulnerable, and she was the only one in the sky who could protect them. Her journey into hell wasn't over yet. She was a ghost of a pilot in a bleeding plane, fueled by nothing but sheer will and the unshakable conviction that she was the only one who could get this done. She was a shield, and a shield doesn't retreat. It holds its ground until the fight is won. The second technical, its driver reacting with a panicked swerve, sped forward, trying to position its mounted machine gun for a clear shot at the Chinooks. The gunner, a young man with a look of desperate rage on his face, was already swiveling the weapon, his gaze locked on the vulnerable, slow-moving helicopters. He didn't see the metal ghost that had just vaporized his companion, and he didn't see the silent predator circling for the kill. He was focused on the sky above, a fatal mistake in a war where the sky was not the only place from which death could descend. Liora, her A-10 rattling and groaning under the strain of the first pass, wasted no time. Her left hydraulic system was a dead weight, and the aircraft was now fighting her with every turn, every micro-adjustment. It was like wrestling with a dying colossal beast. Her forearms were screaming, her hands slick with a mixture of sweat and the desperate need to hold on. The controls were stiff, unresponsive, but she muscled through it, relying on the raw strength and stamina she had built over a lifetime of pushing limits. She banked the wounded Warthog, bringing it around in a tight, desperate arc. The trees and cliffs blurred past her canopy in a claustrophobic rush. This was it, the final act. She lined up the shot, her targeting computer still dead, her aim a matter of pure instinct and timing. She was a hunter, and the second technical was her prey. A frantic, desperate animal trying to escape a force it couldn't comprehend. The truck swerved violently, its tires kicking up dust as the driver tried to change course, but Liora was a step ahead. Her brain, processing a dozen variables per second, had already calculated the new vector. She lined up the shot, her finger a cold, steady thing, squeezing the trigger. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon roared again, its sound a final, apocalyptic punctuation mark on the violence of the last hour. Rounds ripped through the second technical like a chainsaw through dry timber. The insurgents who had been scrambling to fire on the Chinooks vanished in clouds of smoke and dirt. The truck, its chassis shredded by the depleted uranium rounds, crashed into a boulder before erupting in a spectacular fireball, its final act a brief, defiant protest against a force it could not defeat. "Convoy threat destroyed," she said, her voice a strained whisper, her throat raw from the adrenaline. "Chinooks, you're clear to exit west." A pause. Then the voice of the Chinook pilot, a mix of shock and gratitude, crackled over the radio. "Valkyrie, I don't know how the hell you're still flying, but we owe you everything." Liora didn't respond right away. The immediate threat was gone, but the ghost of the valley was still very much alive. She was watching the smoke, the ridges, the trees, searching for any movement, any sign of an ambush, any last attempt. The quiet after the cacophony was more terrifying than the noise. The engine temperature was critical. The hydraulic leak was a catastrophic bleed. The fuel gauge was a mocking, steady red. She was below the minimum required to return safely to Kessel Point. The alarms in her cockpit buzzed again, a persistent, mournful hum that was a testament to the abuse she had put the aircraft through. Her hands began to ache from gripping the controls, a deep, bone-weary pain that shot up her arms and into her shoulders. She was physically and mentally exhausted, 1,000 tiny fractures in her resolve, held together by a single burning thread of pure will. She knew she should turn back. She should conserve what little fuel she had left, try to glide, try to make it to a safe zone. But she couldn't. Not yet. "I'll cover until they breach the ridgeline," she said, her voice a quiet, unshakable command that brooked no argument. It was a statement of fact, not an offer. The voice of command returned, filled with a human desperation that betrayed the professional distance. "Sinclair, You're flying below engine safety limits. Your left turbine may fail. For the love of God, return now." Leora's gaze was fixed on the twin Chinooks. The cockpit was a symphony of failure, but her mind was a place of perfect, calm focus. "Then I'll glide," she said, her voice filled with a finality that silenced all further protests from a world she had already left behind. The two helicopters lifted off, their heavy rotors chopping the thin mountain air, vulnerable and majestic. Liora watched them go, her A-10 a lone wounded ghost with a smoking tail, a defiant shadow in the afternoon light. She weaved between the ridgelines, her nose down, a silent, terrifying promise of death to anyone who dared to challenge them. Every time the Chinook pilots thought she was gone, a phantom of steel, she came back closer, tighter, her presence a silent, unwavering threat that was a far more potent deterrent than 1,000 shots. For 15 more minutes of brutal, agonizing flying, she held her ground, a shield of steel and fire. Her hands ached, her mind screamed, but her will was unbreakable. She was a guardian, not for the glory, but for the sacred trust. As the Chinooks, their bellies full of grateful, exhausted men, finally cleared the last mountain pass and broke into the open, a cheer, raw and triumphant, erupted inside both helicopters. It was the sound of men who had just been born again. "Valkyrie," the SEAL lead radioed, his voice filled with a reverence that Liora didn't feel she had earned. "You're more than a ghost. You're a damn miracle. We owe you beers. Several beers." Liora smiled faintly, a grim, weary expression that did not reach her eyes. She didn't celebrate yet. She had one more problem. The final problem. Getting home. Her gauges were screaming now, fuel at 7%. Hydraulics critically low. The left engine, a dying, choked thing, was barely spinning. Her A-10 felt heavy, sluggish, a wounded bird with a broken wing. Every movement required all her strength, all her willpower. She climbed slightly, reaching the lowest safe return altitude she could risk, skimming the mountain peaks with a dying bird. "Talon Tower, this is Valkyrie," she radioed, her voice low and strained. "I'm en route. Damage critical. Request emergency strip priority." "Valkyrie, priority granted," came the voice of command, no longer an officer but a human being filled with concern. "We have crash response on standby. Do you need to eject?" Liora looked at the open sky ahead, at the mountains shrinking behind her. She looked at the cockpit, a metal shell that had become an extension of her own will. She had pushed it, broken it, bled it dry, but it was still flying. It was a mirror of her own defiance. "No," she said, the word a quiet command that held the weight of 100 battles. "I'm flying it in." The flight back to Kessel Point was not a return. It was a slow, agonizing crawl of a wounded animal. The A-10, its engines screaming in protest, its left wing sensors fried and its hydraulics hemorrhaging, was no longer a war machine. It was a metal skeleton held aloft by a single burning thread of defiance. The red alarm on her fuel gauge was now a constant mocking glow, and the shuddering cough of her left turbine was a rhythm of impending failure. Liora, her hands raw and trembling from gripping the controls, fought every second, every foot of the journey, pouring every ounce of her will into keeping the dying bird in the air. The cockpit was a symphony of alarms, a chorus of failure that she had to manually override to maintain her sanity. She was a ghost in a machine, limping home from a war she had won, but one that was now threatening to claim her in its wake. Inside one of the Chinooks, the roar of the rotors was a triumphant song of escape. The SEALs, battered but alive, were silent, their exhaustion a profound spiritual thing. They looked at each other with a wordless understanding, a shared bond of men who had just looked into the face of death and been pulled back by a force they still couldn't comprehend. The senior chief, a man named Marcus with blood on his boots, and a face etched with the grim reality of 100 missions listened to the radio chatter. He heard the strained, cool voice of Major Vance as she communicated her critical status to Kessel Point. A sudden, deep-seated recognition struck him. The voice. He knew that voice. "She's the one," he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. His words went unnoticed by the other men, who were lost in their own thoughts of survival. He leaned closer to the radio, his eyes wide. "She's the one who saved us 3 years ago near Jalrez. We were pinned down in a marketplace, and a pilot, flying so low we could see her face, strafed an entire enemy convoy for us. We never knew who it was. The mission was blacked out. They called her the Hummingbird because of how low she flew." He shook his head, a grim smile touching his lips. "She's been our guardian angel before. We just never knew her name." The realization sank into him with the weight of a stone. Liora Vance was not just a hero of today, she was a legend he had already lived. Meanwhile, Liora, focused on the treacherous path ahead, spotted it. The final threat! An enemy fighter, wearing scavenged dust gear, emerged from a small cave entrance. A man-pad shoulder-fired anti-air missile held over his shoulder. He wasn't aiming at her. He was aiming at the Chinooks, which were now a vulnerable, lumbering presence against the open sky. He was waiting. He was patient. He was a perfect last ambush. Liora had no flares left. She had no wingman, and with her crippled A-10, a direct engagement was a death sentence. She lined up for a final burst, her finger hovering over the trigger. She squeezed. Click. Her system jammed. The A-10, her voice of fire and fury for the last hour, was silent. Her heart skipped a beat, a cold, hard spike of terror that shot through her chest. She hit the manual reset switch, pounded the control board, her actions frantic, desperate. But it wouldn't fire. She was out of time. The enemy soldier was raising the launcher, his aim now locked on the Chinooks. The missile, a screaming line of death, was seconds away from launch. Liora made her final, most audacious decision. She turned the A-10 toward the cave entrance and dove. The sound of her engines, a primal scream of defiance, filled the valley. The man looked up, his eyes widening in a moment of pure, unadulterated terror. He didn't fire, he froze. He turned to run, but it was too late. Liora flew so low that her right wingtip sheared a piece of the cave's rock entrance, a cascade of debris flying into the air. The downwash from her engines, a physical, unrelenting force, slammed into the fighter, knocking him backward like a rag doll, throwing his weapon uselessly into the dirt. It wasn't fire, it wasn't steel, it was presence. Pure, unrelenting force. "Threat neutralized," she panted, the words a raw, choked whisper in the quiet cockpit. Her A-10, now a barely functional wreck, groaned as it climbed just enough to escape the canyon. The long, agonizing flight back to Kessel Point began. She was a ghost in the sky, a limping, wounded angel. As the base came into view, so did the fire trucks, the med crews, the personnel gathered along the runway, their grim faces expecting a crash. The A-10 came in fast, too fast. She had no flaps, no brakes. She touched down hard. The tires screamed, sparks flew, but she kept it straight, using rudder, muscle, and sheer willpower. The Warthog skidded, slowed, and finally stopped, a steaming, battered monument to her will. Her canopy opened. She climbed out, sweat-soaked, battle-grimed, and silent. The runway crew just stared. They didn't cheer. They were too stunned to do anything but watch as Valkyrie dropped to her knees and exhaled like a titan who had finally stopped fighting the storm. At the debriefing, the mission replay was already underway. The intel officers pieced together the fragmented telemetry from Liora's bird, creating a chilling picture of her flight. The altitude, the speed, the manual overrides, the cannon discharge. It was a story that defied all logic. A Pentagon liaison joined the debrief via encrypted satellite feed, his expression a mask of official disapproval. She broke altitude protocol, entered denied airspace, overrode standard IF procedures, and landed without brake assist. The colonel's jaw tightened. She also saved 12 special operators from being torn to shreds, and an entire Chinook crew. The liaison's voice was a cold blade. I didn't say she wasn't effective. I said she was reckless. Liora, standing at the back of the room, her flight suit still on, spoke for the first time in hours. I was reckless by design. Calculated risk, not panic. Calculated risk isn't in the rule book, Major, the man snapped. No, sir. Neither is survival in that valley. But I'd rather explain breaking rules than write condolence letters. Silence. No one argued with that. The mission was logged as a high-risk success. The full flight data pulled from the black box was classified. Altitude 62 Hungarian forints. Manual override. No targeting system. A historical outlier. A story that would never be officially told. But the world heard it anyway. The leak, the blurred footage, the helmet cam clips. Her name, Liora Vance, and her call sign, Valkyrie, were on the front page of every major outlet. They called her the Valkyrie of the Valley, the pilot who broke stereotypes and physics. She was a national hero, but Liora didn't seek the fame. She wasn't interested in the interviews, the fanfare, the political posturing. She had a different purpose. Her grounding was quietly lifted. But instead of returning to routine missions, she was summoned. They offered her a promotion, a position in DC as a tactical strategist. She listened quietly, then shook her head. Her decision was already made. She didn't fly for fame. She didn't fly for politics. She flew for the men bleeding in that canyon. And she knew that the best way to honor them was to ensure that no one else ever had to fly so alone, so recklessly, so close to death again. And so, Liora Vance returned to the skies, not for headlines or medals, but as a teacher. She designed the first low-altitude combat navigation course, a program that blended instinct with technology, heart with precision. She taught the next generation of pilots, men and women alike, how to read a canyon like a map, how to be fearless without being reckless. Her unofficial motto became a cornerstone of the new curriculum: fly low, fly smart, fly for those who can't. She didn't need medals, she had something better, a legacy. The story of Major Liora Vance is not just a tale of combat aviation, it is a profound testament to the power of the human spirit when pushed beyond the breaking point. We began this journey in a sterile command room, where data and protocols had declared a mission impossible, and we ended it with a woman who proved that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't a cannon, but a single-minded, defiant will. Liora's flight was a collision of man and machine, of courage and chaos, a breathtaking moment where one person's refusal to accept defeat became a shield for others. Her story, now a whispered legend in the halls of military history, serves as a powerful reminder that while rules provide order, it is instinct that forges a path to victory when all other paths have been closed off. She flew on a line of fire, a ghost in the mountains, fueled not by jet fuel alone, but by a deeper sense of duty and a fierce loyalty to the men who needed her. Her journey was a brutal, beautiful, and terrifying dance with death, a solo performance that changed the very nature of modern air combat. She didn't just save 12 lives, she redefined what it meant to be a hero. Her legacy, however, is not a monument of bronze, but a living, breathing force. The Valkyrie doctrine, as it came to be known, wasn't created in a sterile classroom or on a digital simulator. It was forged in the fire of that canyon, a curriculum born of a pilot who learned to trust her gut over her gauges. Liora Vance returned to the skies not for fame, but as a teacher, a leader who understood that the true measure of a warrior is not the battles they win, but the knowledge they pass on. She taught a new generation of pilots that the sky is not just a highway of instruments and procedures, it is a living entity, a force that you must learn to feel, to read, to understand with your heart as much as with your brain. She taught them that sometimes the only way to save a life is to fly where no one else dares to go. She didn't just open a door for women in combat aviation, she tore down the very wall that held them back, proving that the courage and the grit to get the job done is not a matter of gender, but a matter of spirit. Her flight, a historical outlier that was never meant to be replicated, became a cornerstone of modern flight training, a testament to the fact that the impossible is just the untried. Her legacy lives on in every pilot who dares to fly lower, to fly smarter, to fly with the heart of a Valkyrie. Here at Veteran Biker, we believe that the spirit of courage and defiance is not limited to the front lines. It is the same spirit that powers the engines of a motorcycle on the open road, the same will that pushes us to ride into the unknown, to chase the horizon, to feel the wind against our face and the rumble of the engine in our chest. Liora Vance, riding a steel beast through a canyon of fire, embodied that spirit in its purest form. Her story is our story. It is a story of pushing limits, of breaking barriers, and of finding freedom in the face of fear. Her flight beneath the sun is a reminder that in every one of us there is a warrior, a maverick, a Valkyrie waiting to be unleashed. It's a reminder that sometimes the most important journey you will ever take is the one where you are the most alone, the most scared, and the most determined to get to the other side. So, we ask you this: what are your canyons? What are the moments in your life where the rules run out and all you have left is your gut and your courage? When have you had to break protocol to do what was right? Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. We hope Liora Vance's story has inspired you as much as it has inspired us. Your support is what allows us to keep telling these stories of courage, defiance, and honor. Please let us know what you thought of the story in the comments below. We read every single one. And we want to know what you think of Liora's actions. Was she reckless or was she a hero? Let's keep the conversation going. We also have many more stories to tell, so if you want to ride along with us on our next adventure, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. And for more incredible tales from the front lines and the open road, be sure to check out the other videos appearing on your screen right now. Until next time, ride safe and never let anyone tell you something is impossible.